close your eyes and imagine this. You're drifting towards sleep in perfect safety tonight, perhaps scrolling through gentle thoughts as darkness embraces you. But picture, for just one heartbeat, awakening not to the soft hum of modern life, but to the sound of splintering oak and human terror piercing the night air. It's 847 CE. You're a monk hunched over precious manuscripts in the flickering candlelight of Saint-Bertin Monastery in northern France. The Vikings have arrived. Here's what might surprise you. The most chilling aspect of this moment isn't the warriors themselves. It's the realization that among them walk individuals whose calculated cruelty will echo through 1,000 years of whispered warnings. Tonight, we're meeting them not as cartoon monsters, but as devastatingly complex human beings whose darkest impulses were magnified by a world that rewarded violence and punished mercy. Welcome to an intimate journey through the Viking Age's deepest shadows, where the most fascinating stories belong not to the greatest heroes, but to those who chose to become something else entirely. Together, we'll discover how ordinary human psychology transformed into legendary darkness, and what their choices reveal about the fragile miracle of our peaceful, modern world. Dear companion of the quiet hours, welcome to this sacred space between wakefulness and dreams. Whether you found your way here seeking stories to ease you toward rest, or you're simply drawn to the magnetic pull of forgotten histories, I'm deeply honored to walk beside you through tonight's exploration. Allow yourself to settle completely into this moment. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. Notice the familiar sounds of your safe, modern world. Perhaps the distant hum of electricity, the soft whisper of heating systems, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. These sounds are your anchors, reminding you that you exist in an era of unprecedented safety and comfort. But tonight, we're going to step carefully across the threshold into a world where such safety was not just rare. It was almost unimaginable. I want to acknowledge something important before we begin. The stories we're about to explore together contain darkness, real darkness, born from real human choices that caused real suffering. We're not venturing into this territory for shock value or entertainment, but because understanding these shadows helps us appreciate the extraordinary light of our modern world. Think of it this way. When you understand how fragile civilization truly is, every peaceful night becomes a small miracle. Every unlocked door, every trusting conversation with a stranger, every child playing fearlessly in a park. The individuals we'll meet tonight lived in a world where strength determined survival, where mercy was often mistaken for weakness, and where reputation could mean the difference between life and death. But here's what makes our exploration so fascinating. Even within that brutal context, some people made choices that shocked their contemporaries. Their actions were so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that they stood out like dark stars against an already violent sky. These weren't mindless brutes or mythical monsters. They were intelligent, often charismatic individuals who understood human psychology with terrifying precision. They were innovators in their own twisted way, pushing the boundaries of what their society considered acceptable. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they were successful. Their tactics worked. Their cruelty achieved its intended goals. But why explore such darkness? Because within these stories lie profound truths about human nature that can only be understood when we witness them in their most extreme forms. Tonight's journey will reveal how environmental pressures, cultural expectations, and personal psychology can combine to create legendary evil. More importantly, it will help us recognize how the same human impulses that created these dark figures also drive the heroes, innovators, and ordinary decent people who make our modern world possible. As we travel together through the fjords and longhouses of the Viking Age, you'll notice something remarkable happening. The more deeply we understand the harsh realities that shape these individuals, the more grateful we become for the invisible infrastructure of kindness that surrounds us today. Every law that protects the innocent, every social safety net that catches the falling, every cultural norm that encourages empathy over exploitation. I invite you to approach tonight's stories with the curiosity of an explorer and the compassion of a healer. We're not here to judge people from 1,000 years ago by modern standards, but to understand how human beings navigate impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. Some of tonight's figures made choices that created immense suffering, Others found ways to maintain their humanity despite circumstances that would break most of us. The beauty of exploring history from the comfort of your safe, warm space is that you can afford to be generous with your understanding. You can examine these dark chapters of human experience without fear, knowing that the world they inhabited no longer exists. The systemic violence, the casual cruelty, the desperate scramble for survival that characterized their daily lives. So let your mind wander freely through the landscapes we'll explore together. Feel the bite of North Sea wind, hear the creak of wooden ships, witness the desperate courage of people trying to survive in a world that offered no guarantees. And as you experience these distant realities, let them deepen your appreciation for the miracle of the modern world you'll return to when our journey ends. We're about to discover that understanding evil doesn't make us evil. Instead, it makes us wiser, more grateful, and ultimately more human. The darkness we'll explore together will only serve to make us more appreciative of the light that surrounds us now. Are you ready to begin? Close your eyes and feel the bite of wind that cuts through wool and flesh alike, carrying with it the scent of salt, blood, and desperate hunger. You're standing on the edge of a Norwegian fjord in the year 832 CE, and the world around you is dying. Not metaphorically, literally dying. The summer that should have brought life has delivered only stunted barley and rotting fish. The winter stretches endlessly ahead like a hungry beast, and you can already hear it in the voices around you. That particular tone of quiet desperation that precedes terrible choices. Your breath forms crystals in the air as you watch children grow thinner by the day, their eyes too large in faces that seem to shrink with each passing sunset. This is the crucible that forged legends of cruelty. Imagine the weight of absolute responsibility crushing down on shoulders barely prepared to bear it. You're not just hungry, you're the person others look to for survival. Your family, your neighbors, your entire community depends on decisions you'll make in the next few weeks. And here's the brutal mathematics of Viking Age existence. Your compassion might kill everyone you love. Feel the ice beneath your feet as you walk toward the harbor where sleek longships wait like predatory birds. Each vessel represents a choice between certain starvation and possible survival through violence. The smell of pine tar and seal oil mingles with something else. The metallic scent of weapons being sharpened, of men preparing to transform themselves into instruments of other people's nightmares. But here's what separates ordinary desperation from legendary evil. Most Vikings who went raiding did so reluctantly, viewing violence as a necessary evil for survival. The individuals we're exploring tonight were different. They discovered something intoxicating in the process of causing fear, something that transcended mere necessity and became art. Listen to the sound of your own heartbeat echoing in the longhouse as winter deepens. The wooden walls creak under the weight of accumulated snow, and somewhere in that rhythmic groaning, you begin to understand how environment shapes psychology. When survival requires constant vigilance, when every resource must be fought for, when showing weakness invites death, the human mind begins to adapt in ways that would seem monstrous to modern sensibilities. Taste the fermented fish that keeps you alive through the dark months. Its sharp flavor, a constant reminder that comfort is a luxury you cannot afford. Feel the smoke from seal oil lamps burning your eyes as you huddle with dozens of others in spaces barely large enough for half that number. Privacy, personal space, individual preferences. These become meaningless concepts when survival demands collective action. Now add to this environment the single most powerful force in Viking society, reputation. In our modern world, a damaged reputation might cost you a job or social standing. In the Viking Age, it could cost you everything. Your ability to form alliances, secure marriages for your children, gain support during conflicts, even receive help during disasters. All of this depended on how others perceived your strength, cunning, and resolve. Weakness wasn't just personal failure, it was community death sentence. Picture yourself in the great hall of a powerful Jarl, watching how carefully each word is weighed, each gesture calculated. The man beside you might be your closest friend, but if he perceives weakness in you, he might also become the one who decides your family doesn't deserve limited resources when the next famine comes. Trust, in this world, is a luxury that can kill. Feel the pressure building like ice forming on a lake. Invisible at first, then suddenly capable of supporting entire armies or crushing everything beneath its weight. In such an environment, displays of strength become not just advantageous, but essential. And for some individuals, this pressure created a terrible kind of innovation. The most cunning among them realized that reputation could be manufactured through spectacle. Violence wasn't just about achieving immediate goals. It was about creating stories that would travel farther than any longship, ensuring that your name alone could accomplish what armies might struggle to achieve. The psychology was brilliant in its simplicity. Make your cruelty so memorable, so creatively terrifying, that potential enemies would surrender rather than risk experiencing it themselves. Imagine the moment when ordinary brutality transforms into calculated artistry. You're watching a Viking leader realize that the way he kills enemies matters as much as the fact that he kills them. The victim's suffering becomes secondary to the audience's reaction. Death becomes theater, and terror becomes currency more valuable than silver or gold. Listen to the whispered conversations in the shadows of the Longhouse, where young warriors debate not just how to fight, but how to be remembered. In a world where oral tradition carries your legacy forward, the most extreme stories survive, while ordinary courage fades into forgotten darkness. The incentive structure was clear. Extraordinary cruelty created extraordinary reputation. Feel the bitter wind carrying rumors across the frozen landscape. Stories of kings who turned execution into religious ritual, of warriors who invented new forms of torture, of leaders who used psychological manipulation with surgical precision. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated performances designed to build legends that would outlast the performers themselves. But here's where the environment reveals its most insidious influence. It normalized the abnormal. When everyone around you accepts that survival requires violence, when your culture celebrates warriors who push boundaries, when your gods themselves are portrayed as beings who solve problems through creative brutality, the line between necessary evil and pure sadism begins to blur. Picture the moment when a young Viking realizes that he enjoys the fear in his enemy's eyes more than the victory itself. The environment didn't create this psychological twist, but it certainly provided the perfect conditions for it to flourish. What might have remained a disturbing personal inclination in a peaceful society became the foundation for legendary status in a world that rewarded extremes. Taste the ash of burned villages on the wind. Smell the smoke that carries both destruction and opportunity. Feel the weight of decisions that will echo through generations. The terrible freedom that comes from realizing that conventional morality is a luxury your world cannot afford. This is the psychological landscape where ordinary people discovered they could become gods of terror. The most chilling aspect of this environment wasn't that it created monsters. It's that it revealed how easily the capacity for monstrous behavior exists within ordinary human psychology when the right pressures are applied. Remove the social safety nets, eliminate the luxury of moral contemplation, reward extreme behavior, and add the intoxicating possibility of immortal reputation. And you create a perfect storm for legendary evil. As the northern lights dance across the frozen sky above you, casting ethereal shadows on the ice-covered fjords, you begin to understand that the individuals we're about to meet weren't born different from anyone else. They were shaped by a world that demanded extraordinary measures for ordinary survival, then rewarded those who pushed beyond even those extremes. In such a world, those who stood out for cruelty had to be truly exceptional indeed. Step into the war tent of a legend. The year is 867 CE, and you're standing behind the most feared tactical mind in the Viking world. Before you sits a man whose very presence seems to bend reality around his will, Ivar Ragnarsson, called the Boneless. Feel the weight of the moment as candlelight flickers across maps spread on rough wooden tables. The air is thick with the smell of leather, weapon oil, and something else. The electric tension of brilliant intellect focused on destruction. Ivar's hands move across the parchment with surgical precision, marking positions, calculating angles, orchestrating not just a battle, but a performance that will haunt nightmares for centuries. But here's what makes your blood run cold. He's not planning a quick death for King Ella of Northumbria. He's designing an artwork of agony. Look closely at the man before you. Where other Viking leaders radiate physical power, Ivar emanates something far more dangerous. Pure, crystallized intelligence wrapped in a body that betrays him. His legs, twisted and fragile from what we now recognize as likely osteogenesis imperfecta, force him to rely on something his warrior culture rarely celebrated: the devastating power of a mind unleashed. Listen to his voice as he explains the blood eagle ritual to his captains. There's no emotion in his words, no rage or passion, just the clinical precision of an architect describing blueprints. He speaks of cracking ribs, of lungs pulled through the victim's back to form wings, of salt rubbed into wounds, as casually as other men discuss the weather. This isn't madness. This is methodology. Feel the chill of recognition as you realize what you're witnessing, the birth of psychological warfare as an art form. In the warrior culture of the Vikings, Ivar faced a unique challenge. While his brothers could prove their worth through feats of strength, he had to find other ways to command respect. But rather than accepting limitation, he transformed disadvantage into devastating advantage. If he couldn't be the strongest warrior, he would become something far more terrifying: the most creative killer. Imagine the internal world of someone who discovered that intellectual cruelty could achieve what physical prowess could not. Picture the moment when young Ivar realized that a reputation for calculated brutality could make armies surrender without a single blow struck. The psychology is both brilliant and chilling. He weaponized fear itself. Watch his eyes as he describes how King Ella will die. There's something almost clinical in his gaze, as if he's studying a particularly interesting specimen. This isn't personal revenge, though his father Ragnar's death at Ella's hands certainly provides motivation. This is strategic theatre, designed to send a message that will travel faster than any longship across the known world. The Blood Eagle wasn't just execution, it was advertisement. Every detail was calculated for maximum psychological impact on future enemies. The religious symbolism, transforming the victim into a twisted offering to Odin, added spiritual weight to political terror. The prolonged suffering ensured that witnesses would never forget. The artistic elements turned death into spectacle that demanded retelling. But here's where Ivar's genius becomes truly unsettling. He understood that the story of the torture would ultimately matter more than the torture itself. He was crafting legend, knowing that future enemies would surrender rather than risk experiencing what King Ella endured. One horrific death would prevent hundreds of battles. Feel the weight of that calculation. Ivar looked at human suffering and saw strategic value. He transformed empathy into a weakness he could exploit in others, while systematically eliminating it from his own psychological makeup. This wasn't the heat of battle brutality that characterized normal Viking warfare. This was cold, premeditated artistry. Picture the scene when the Blood Eagle was finally performed. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, writing years later with trembling hands, struggled to find words for what they described. But imagine being there, feeling the terrible silence of hundreds of warriors watching their leader transform execution into religious ritual. The sound of cracking bone echoing across the battlefield. The victim's breathing becoming labored as his lungs were exposed to air they were never meant to touch. And through it all, Ivar watching with the detached interest of a master craftsman admiring his work. But the most chilling aspect of this scene isn't the physical torture, it's the psychological sophistication behind it. Ivar understood that the human mind's capacity for imagination often exceeds reality's capacity for horror. By creating something so extreme that it transcended normal experience, he ensured that the story would grow in the telling, becoming more terrible with each retelling. Modern psychological research reveals patterns that Ivar intuited centuries before science could explain them. He understood that extreme violence, when performed with ritualistic precision, creates a form of learned helplessness in observers. Witnesses become psychologically paralyzed, unable to process what they've seen, making them less likely to resist future encounters. Think about the internal world of someone who could orchestrate such calculated cruelty. While his physical disability might have created deep psychological wounds, the constant awareness of being different in a culture that prized physical perfection, Ivar transformed that pain into power over others. Instead of allowing his limitations to diminish him, he used them to develop capabilities that his physically capable brothers could never match. There's something almost modern in his approach to psychological manipulation. He understood branding, reputation management, and strategic communication in ways that wouldn't seem out of place in contemporary corporate warfare. The Blood Eagle wasn't just revenge, it was marketing. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ivar's legacy lies in how effectively his methods worked. After King Ella's execution, Ivar's reputation for creative cruelty preceded him like a weapon. Cities surrendered rather than risk his attention. Warriors abandoned battlefields at the mere rumour of his presence. He had achieved something remarkable. He had made his intellectual gifts more feared than any sword. Listen to the whispered conversations around campfires throughout England, where parents warned children about the boneless king who turned death into art. Feel the shiver of recognition as you realise that Ivar had achieved a form of immortality through carefully crafted terror. Long after his physical death, his psychological legacy continued to shape events across the Viking world. The most unsettling truth about Ivar the Boneless isn't that he was a monster. It's that he was a genius who chose to apply his gifts to the systematic creation of human suffering. In a different time, with different pressures, that same intellect might have built cities instead of destroying them, might have created beauty instead of orchestrating terror. But the world that shaped Ivar rewarded only one kind of innovation, and he became its most accomplished practitioner. As you stand in that war tent, watching him plan his next campaign with the methodical precision of a chess master, you begin to understand something that makes your blood run cold. Ivar the Boneless didn't just happen to be cruel. He chose cruelty because he recognized its effectiveness, then perfected it with the same intellectual rigor that others might apply to poetry or architecture. He had discovered that in a world where physical strength was temporary, psychological terror could be eternal, and the most terrifying aspect of his legacy. Other leaders were watching, learning, and preparing to push his innovations even further into the darkness of human possibility. Step into the sacred grove where gods whisper approval of human artistry painted in blood. The morning mist clings to ancient oaks like ghostly witnesses, and you can taste the metallic anticipation hanging in the air. This is no ordinary execution ground. This is a theatre where death becomes divine performance, where the line between worship and warfare dissolves into something both beautiful and utterly terrifying. Feel the rhythm of your own heartbeat as it synchronizes with the drums echoing across the clearing. You're witnessing the transformation of revenge into religious ritual, where skilled practitioners like Torf Einar of Orkney have elevated brutality to the level of sacred art. The victim bound before the altar isn't just an enemy. He's about to become an offering that bridges the mortal and divine worlds. Listen to the chanting that rises and falls like ocean waves, ancient Norse words that invoke Odin's blessing on what's about to unfold. The air thrums with spiritual electricity as warrior priests prepare instruments that serve dual purposes, surgical tools and religious implements, designed not just to kill, but to create something transcendent from human suffering. Watch the master craftsman approach his canvas of flesh and bone. Torf Einar moves with the deliberate grace of an artist who has perfected his medium through years of practice. His hands don't shake, they glide with surgical precision as he explains each step to the assembled witnesses. The first incision along the spine, the careful separation of ribs from backbone, the gentle, almost tender way the lungs are drawn through the opening to form wings of crimson. But here's what makes this moment transcend ordinary cruelty. The victim is conscious, experiencing every sensation as his body is transformed into a living representation of an eagle in flight. The salt rubbed into the wounds isn't just torture, it's preservation, ensuring the ritual achieves its full artistic impact. The slow, rhythmic breathing that grows more labored with each passing moment becomes part of the ceremony's musical composition. Feel the collective intake of breath from hundreds of witnesses as they watch life slowly ebb from the eagle-shaped form. This isn't entertainment, it's religious education. Every person present is learning about the power of gods who demand such elaborate offerings, about leaders who can command not just death, but artistic death, about the thin line between mortal flesh and divine symbol. The blood eagle represents something unprecedented in human history, the systematization of creative cruelty as spiritual practice. While other cultures executed enemies, the Vikings transformed execution into performance art that served multiple purposes simultaneously: political terror, religious devotion, artistic expression, and psychological warfare, all converged in a single, unforgettable spectacle. Imagine the psychological sophistication required to conceive such a ritual. The practitioner must understand anatomy well enough to keep the victim conscious throughout the process. They must grasp theatrical timing, knowing exactly how long each stage should last for maximum impact. They must comprehend religious symbolism, ensuring every detail serves the greater spiritual narrative. And they must possess the emotional detachment necessary to treat human suffering as raw material for divine artistry. Picture the moment when ordinary Viking warriors realized they were witnessing something beyond their previous understanding of violence. The blood eagle wasn't just punishment, it was transformation. The victim became sacrifice, the executioner became priest, and the witnesses became congregation in a church built from human agony. But perhaps most chilling is how the ritual reveals the aesthetic sensibility behind such calculated cruelty. The eagle shape wasn't chosen randomly. It represented Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, who flew across the world gathering information for the Allfather. The victims' final breaths became prayers carried directly to divine ears. Their suffering was literally transformed into spiritual communication. Feel the weight of understanding as you realize what you're witnessing. The birth of institutionalized artistic terrorism. Leaders like Torf Einar discovered that spectacular violence could achieve what armies sometimes couldn't. Complete psychological dominance over enemies who would rather surrender than risk experiencing such elaborate death. The ritual's power lay not just in its brutality, but in its beauty. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, writing decades later, couldn't help but describe the blood eagle with a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration. They recognized they were documenting something unprecedented, murder that had been elevated to the level of religious art. Listen to the silence that follows the victim's final breath, a hush so complete it seems to encompass the entire world. Then hear the explosion of voices as witnesses begin processing what they've experienced. Others cheer. Many simply stare in stunned recognition that they've witnessed something that will haunt their dreams and shape their understanding of human possibility. But the true genius of the blood eagle wasn't the ritual itself, it was how the story spread. Each witness became a missionary of terror, carrying detailed accounts to distant lands where potential enemies would hear these descriptions and understand exactly what awaited those who defied Viking leaders capable of such creative brutality. Think about the psychological impact on the practitioners themselves. Men like Torf Einar didn't just perform the blood eagle, they perfected it, adding innovations and refinements that increased both its spiritual significance and its capacity to generate lasting trauma in observers. They became connoisseurs of human suffering, developing aesthetic standards for acts that transcended ordinary cruelty. The most disturbing aspect of the blood eagle's legacy lies in how it normalized the abnormal. What began as exceptional punishment for extraordinary crimes gradually became an expected element of Viking justice. Leaders who failed to demonstrate such creative cruelty risked appearing weak, forcing them to develop their own innovations in spectacular violence. Picture the ripple effect spreading across the Viking world as stories of these rituals reached distant shores. Local leaders, hearing accounts of blood eagles and similar practices, understood they needed to develop comparable displays of artistic brutality or risk being seen as unworthy of respect. The blood eagle became a standard that spawned countless variations, each designed to prove the practitioner's spiritual connection to divine violence. As the morning mist finally clears from the sacred grove, revealing the artistic arrangement of flesh and bone that was once a living human being, you begin to understand something that makes your spirit shiver. The blood eagle represents humanity's capacity to transform its darkest impulses into religious art. The most terrifying truth isn't that such rituals existed, it's that they worked. They achieved their intended goals with devastating effectiveness, creating a legacy of psychological warfare that influenced military strategy for generations. And in the shadows of that grove, other practitioners were already imagining how they might surpass even these elaborate displays of sacred violence. Enter the gilded prison of absolute power, where every shadow harbors potential betrayal, and every smile conceals a dagger. You're standing in the great hall of Erik Haraldsson, Erik Bloodaxe. And the air itself seems to vibrate with paranoid tension so thick you could cut it with a sea axe. This is what happens when a brilliant mind discovers that the greatest threat to a king often wears the face of family. Feel the weight of invisible eyes watching your every movement as you navigate this court where laughter dies too quickly and conversations halt when footsteps approach. The year is 930 CE, and you're witnessing the systematic transformation of brotherly love into calculated murder, where political necessity has corrupted the most sacred bonds of blood and kinship. Listen to the nervous quality of voices around the feast table, where Eric's remaining brothers speak in carefully measured tones, each word weighed for hidden meanings. Notice how nobody meets his gaze directly, how conversations flow around him like water around a stone. This isn't just respect, it's the primal recognition that you're in the presence of a predator who has discovered that family makes the most dangerous enemies. But here's what makes Eric's story so chillingly modern. He didn't kill his brothers in fits of rage or passion. He eliminated them with the methodical precision of a corporate restructuring, each death carefully timed and orchestrated to maximize political advantage while minimizing backlash. This was dynastic management through systematic fratricide. Picture the moment when young Eric first realized that his father Harold Fairhair's kingdom would never be large enough for all his sons. While other princes might have accepted lesser roles or sought glory in distant lands, Eric saw a different solution: reduce the competition through strategic elimination. It was brilliant, it was efficient, it was absolutely terrifying. Watch his eyes as he explains to his war council why his brother Bjorn must die. There's no hatred there, no emotional investment, just the cold calculation of a chess master removing pieces from the board. Bjorn isn't his brother in this moment. He's a political obstacle that happens to share genetic material. The transformation of familial love into strategic thinking represents a kind of psychological alchemy that few humans can achieve. Feel the chill of recognition as you witness the birth of political paranoia as governing philosophy. Eric understood something that would make Machiavelli proud centuries later. In the game of absolute power, mercy is often indistinguishable from weakness, and weakness is invariably fatal. But the true genius of Eric's approach lay in how he normalized fratricide within his court. Each brother's death was presented not as family betrayal, but as necessary statecraft. He created an environment where questioning these killings became tantamount to treason, transforming his personal paranoia into official policy. Listen to the whispered conversations in the castle corridors, where servants speak in code about the latest hunting accident or tragic illness that has claimed another royal brother. Notice how quickly people learn to stop asking questions, how efficiently a culture of willful blindness develops when the alternative is joining the victims. The psychological sophistication required for such systematic elimination is staggering. Eric had to compartmentalize his emotions completely, separating the part of his mind that might feel brotherly affection from the part that planned their deaths. He became a master of emotional dissociation, treating family ties as strategic liabilities rather than human connections. Picture the moment when Eric's surviving brothers finally understood what was happening. The dawning horror of realizing that the person they'd grown up with, shared childhood memories with, trusted above all others, had been systematically planning their deaths while sharing meals and exchanging embraces. This wasn't betrayal. It was something far more disturbing: the complete absence of human connection beneath a perfectly maintained facade of fraternal love. But perhaps most unsettling is how effectively Eric's methods worked. With each brother eliminated, his position grew stronger. Potential rivals disappeared, succession questions simplified, and his path to unchallenged power became clearer. The kingdom didn't suffer from these deaths. It became more efficiently managed under single leadership. Feel the terrible logic of his position as you realize what you're witnessing: the birth of institutional paranoia that would influence royal courts for centuries. Eric proved that systematic elimination of family rivals could be an effective governing strategy, creating a template that future rulers would follow when faced with similar challenges. Watch how the surviving court members adapt to this new reality. They develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to Eric's moods, learning to read micro-expressions and subtle cues that might indicate whether they'll survive the day. The entire social structure reshapes itself around one man's pathological need for control. But here's where Eric's story becomes truly modern. His paranoia wasn't irrational. His brothers were genuinely potential threats to his power. In the context of Viking succession law, where any son of the king could legitimately claim the throne, Eric's murders were strategically sound. He had identified a real problem and solved it with brutal efficiency. Listen to the sound of your own breathing in the oppressive silence of Eric's hall, where even the crackling of fires seems muted by the weight of unspoken fears. This is what absolute power looks like when wielded by someone who has recognized that human relationships are ultimately political calculations. The most disturbing aspect of Eric's legacy lies in how his methods spread throughout the Viking world. Other rulers, hearing stories of his successful consolidation of power through fratricide, began implementing similar policies. What began as one man's paranoid solution to a succession problem became an accepted element of royal statecraft. Picture the ripple effects spreading across Scandinavia as Eric's example influenced other royal families. Brothers who might once have lived in peace began viewing each other as existential threats. The bonds of family, already strained by competition for limited resources, began snapping under the pressure of Eric's precedent. But the true horror of Eric's story isn't just the murders themselves. It's the psychological landscape he created, where such murders became not just acceptable, but expected. He normalized the abnormal, transforming fratricide from shocking crime into prudent policy. Feel the weight of understanding as you realize what Eric represents, the moment when political necessity completely overwhelms human connection. He stands as proof that brilliant minds, when focused on the wrong objectives, can create systems of cruelty that outlast their creators. The loneliness of his position becomes almost palpable as you watch him navigate a world where every relationship has been poisoned by calculation. He achieved absolute power by eliminating everyone who might genuinely care about him as a person rather than fear him as a ruler. In securing his throne, he had created a perfect prison of isolation. As you watch Eric Bloodaxe survey his domain from the high seat that cost him every meaningful human relationship he'd ever possessed, you begin to understand something that makes the soul shiver. Sometimes the most effective monsters are those who convince themselves that monstrous behavior is merely practical policy. And in the shadows of his hall, other ambitious minds were already learning that the systematic elimination of inconvenient family members could be rebranded as effective leadership. The age of political fratricide had begun, and its architects were just getting started. Close your eyes and feel the rough hemp rope cutting into your wrists. The salt spray from the North Sea stings your face as you're dragged across the wooden planks of a Viking longship. Your name was once spoken with love by people who knew you. Perhaps you were Aelred, a Saxon farmer, or Brigid, an Irish weaver. But that name, that identity, that entire world is dissolving like morning mist. Welcome to the most lucrative and systematically cruel industry of the Viking Age. Human trafficking on an industrial scale. The rope burns on your ankles throb with each step as you stumble forward, part of a line of perhaps 30 souls. Men, women, children, connected by iron chains that clank with the rhythm of despair. The Vikings call you thrall slave, but you're learning that this simple word encompasses a universe of calculated dehumanization that would make modern traffickers seem like amateurs. At the front of this human cargo walks a man whose name has echoed through the darkest corners of medieval history, Thori Hund, though he represents dozens of others who built fortunes on the systematic destruction of human dignity. Watch him carefully as he moves among his merchandise. Notice how his eyes assess each captive with the cold calculation of a livestock dealer, evaluating strength, fertility, potential resistance, market value. But here's what makes your blood run cold. Thorir isn't a mindless brute. He's a businessman, an innovator, a man who's turned human suffering into a precise science. He's developed techniques for breaking spirits that go far beyond simple physical brutality. He understands human psychology in ways that are both brilliant and terrifying. Listen to him speaking to his crew in Old Norse, his voice carrying across the deck like a merchant discussing grain prices. The young ones adapt faster if you separate them from their mothers immediately. The older men break their pride first, their bodies second. Make them watch their daughters serve the crew. Make them grateful for scraps. Feel the wooden deck rough beneath your bare feet as you're herded below into the ship's belly. The stench hits you like a physical blow. Unwashed bodies, human waste. The sweet sick smell of infection, the metallic tang of blood from fresh wounds. 40 souls packed into a space meant for cargo. The ceiling so low you can't stand upright. In the suffocating darkness, you begin to understand the true architecture of Viking slavery. This isn't random violence. It's a carefully constructed system designed to strip away everything that makes you human. Thorir and men like him have studied their victims. understanding that physical chains are nothing compared to psychological ones. Your mind reels as you realize the sophistication of their methods. They don't just capture people, they systematically destroy identity. Names are forbidden. You're now just number 7 or the tall one. Languages are mixed deliberately. Saxon next to Celt, next to Slav, preventing communication, community, resistance. Families are separated not just physically, but psychologically, with children forced to watch parents humiliated. Spouses made to choose between their own survival and their loved one's dignity. The psychological torture is methodical. They've learned that humans can endure almost any physical pain if they maintain hope, dignity, connection to others. So those connections are systematically severed. You're forced to compete with other slaves for food, water, basic necessities. You're made complicit in others' suffering. You're given small privileges that depend on betraying fellow captives. But the true genius of their cruelty lies in how they make you grateful for basic humanity. After days of being treated like livestock, when a guard speaks to you like a person, when someone offers you clean water, when you're allowed to comfort a crying child, these small mercies feel like gifts. You begin to thank your captors for moments of reduced suffering. Feel your stomach contract with hunger as the ship's motion makes the stale bread and spoiled fish even less appealing. Around you, weaker captives are already dying. The elderly, the sick, the heartbroken. Their bodies will be thrown overboard without ceremony. Just business expenses in Thoria's mental calculations. The economic scale is staggering. A healthy adult slave might bring the equivalent of 8 cows in the markets of Dublin, Rouen, or Constantinople. Children are worth less individually, but easier to transport and train. Young women command premium prices. The mathematics of human misery have been refined to precise profit margins. You begin to understand that you're part of a vast network that stretches from Greenland to the Black Sea. Thori's operation is just one node in a system that annually moves thousands of human beings like commodities. Entire communities have been built on this trade, not just the raiders, but shipbuilders, guards, transporters, market organizers, the customers who create demand. The psychological profiles of these slave traders reveal something chilling about human nature. Many weren't born monsters. They were ordinary people who discovered they had a talent for systematic cruelty and found a society that rewarded it handsomely. They developed professional pride in their efficiency, their innovation, their ability to extract maximum profit from human despair. But perhaps most disturbing is how they justified it to themselves. You overhear conversations where they discuss slaves as naturally inferior, as grateful for the civilization of servitude, as better off under Norse rule than in their primitive home communities. They've constructed elaborate philosophical frameworks that transform systematic cruelty into moral necessity. As the days blur together in the ship's belly, you witness how prolonged trauma changes people. Some captives retreat into madness, perhaps the kindest escape available. Others become ruthlessly pragmatic, willing to do anything to survive. A few maintain defiant dignity that inspires and terrifies in equal measure. The ship's destination approaches, and with it, your introduction to the slave markets that dot the Viking world. These aren't chaotic bazaars, but organized institutions with standardized procedures, quality inspections, warranty systems, financing options. Human trafficking has become as sophisticated as any other medieval industry. Your journey through this nightmare has revealed one of history's most uncomfortable truths. Systematic cruelty often isn't the product of madness or passion, but of intelligent, methodical people who found ways to profit from others' suffering. The Viking slave trade succeeded because it combined brutal efficiency with psychological sophistication, creating a machine for destroying human dignity that operated for centuries. As consciousness begins to fade with exhaustion and despair, you carry with you the knowledge that the capacity for such calculated cruelty exists within human civilization, waiting for the right combination of opportunity, cultural acceptance, and individual moral flexibility to emerge again. Step now into the smoky Great Hall of Halfdan the Black, father of Harold Fairhair, where innovation meets brutality in ways that would influence generations of Viking warriors. The year is approximately 860 CE, and you're witnessing something that will reshape how war is waged across medieval Europe, the birth of psychological warfare as high art. Halfdan sits on his carved throne, not as a raging berserker, but as a contemplative strategist whose pale eyes seem to peer directly into human souls, cataloguing weaknesses, identifying pressure points, calculating exactly how much suffering will achieve his political goals. His nickname, the Black, doesn't refer to his hair or complexion, but to the shadow he casts over human consciousness. Feel the tension in this hall where even hardened warriors speak in whispers. These men have witnessed Halfdan's methods, and what they've seen has changed them. Traditional Viking warfare was brutal, but straightforward: raid, fight, conquer, move on. Halfdan has transformed violence into something far more sinister, a precise instrument for reshaping human behavior on a massive scale. Watch him as he receives reports from his scouts about a rebellious chieftain's stronghold. Most leaders would ask about defenses, troop numbers, strategic positions. Halfdan's first questions are different. Tell me about his children. What are their names? Which does he love most? Does he have elderly parents? Any brothers with families? What stories do his people tell about their ancestors? You're witnessing the birth of what military historians would later call fourth-generation warfare, conflict that targets not enemy armies, but the psychological foundations of enemy societies. Halfdan has realized that breaking a community's spirit is more effective than breaking their walls, and infinitely more lasting. His innovations in cruelty are methodical and chilling. Where other raiders might execute captured enemies quickly, Halfdan has developed prolonged torture techniques designed not just to extract information, but to create living examples of what resistance costs. He's learned that one person tortured in front of their community creates more psychological damage than dozens killed in battle. But his true genius lies in understanding family dynamics as weapons. Listen to him explaining his philosophy to a young warrior. Kill a man's son, and you create an enemy for life. Capture his son, treat the boy well, and make the father choose between surrender and his child's suffering. Now you've broken something deeper than bone. Now you own his soul. The captured families of enemy chieftains become pawns in Halfdan's psychological chess games. Children are kept comfortable but visible, their welfare obviously dependent on their parents' cooperation. Wives are treated with elaborate courtesy while their husbands watch helplessly, understanding that this respect exists only at Halfdan's whim. Elderly parents are shown exaggerated kindness that emphasizes their vulnerability. Feel the cold calculation as he designs scenarios where enemy leaders must choose between their own honor and their loved one's safety. A rival chieftain must watch his daughter serve at Halfdan's table. Not harmed, not disrespected, but utterly controlled. A captured warrior must decide whether to reveal strategic information or watch his young son grow up as Halfdan's thrall. These aren't random acts of cruelty, but carefully orchestrated psychological operations. Halfdan has studied human nature like a scholar studies texts, identifying the specific pressures that break different types of people. Proud warriors crumble when forced to beg for mercy. Religious leaders lose faith when their prayers go unanswered. Community elders despair when they cannot protect their people. His methods spread through Viking culture like a plague. Young warriors who serve under Halfdan carry these techniques to their own commands, refining and expanding upon them. What begins as one man's innovation becomes an entire generation's approach to warfare. The psychological sophistication of Viking raids increases dramatically, making them far more devastating to target communities. You witness how these techniques affect the perpetrators themselves. Warriors who once felt satisfaction in honorable combat now struggle with nightmares about the things they've done. Some embrace the darkness completely, becoming monsters who enjoy others' psychological suffering. Others develop elaborate justifications. They're creating peace through superior strategy. They're ending conflicts more efficiently. They're preventing greater bloodshed through decisive action. Halfdan himself seems almost clinical in his detachment. He shows genuine curiosity about human psychology, asking detailed questions about how different torture techniques affect various personality types. He's developing what amounts to a scientific approach to breaking human will, treating psychological torture as a craft to be perfected rather than a necessary evil to be endured. The long-term consequences ripple through Scandinavian society. Communities that might have resisted traditional raids surrender immediately when they recognize Halfdan's banners. Parents tell children stories about his methods to ensure compliance with authority. The mere possibility of falling into his hands becomes a tool of social control, that extends far beyond his actual territory. Watch him training his son, Harold, the future Fairhair, in these techniques. The boy learns not just swordplay and battle tactics, but the psychological principles that will help him unite Norway through strategic terror. Halfdan is creating a dynasty built not just on military strength, but on sophisticated understanding of human weakness. The hall falls silent as Halfdan reviews reports of his latest campaign's success. An entire region has submitted without battle after witnessing what happened to one rebellious village. Men, women, and children now live in terror of displeasing their new ruler, not because of what he's done to them, but because of what they've seen him do to others. His innovations in prolonged psychological pressure become legendary. Captured enemies are kept alive for months, their treatment varying unpredictably between kindness and cruelty. This uncertainty proves more psychologically damaging than consistent torture, as victims never know what to expect, their minds constantly calculating, hoping, fearing. But perhaps most disturbing is how Halfdan has normalized these techniques. His hall celebrates psychological victories like traditional warriors celebrated battlefield triumphs. Young men compete to devise more creative methods of psychological pressure. The torture of enemies becomes entertainment, discussed over meals like farming techniques or weather patterns. As you observe this court of calculated cruelty, you understand that you're witnessing a transformation in human warfare that will echo through centuries. Halfdan the Black hasn't just perfected methods of individual torture. He's created a systematic approach to psychological domination that turns entire populations into willing subjects through carefully calibrated fear. The fire in the Great Hall burns low as Halfdan retires for the evening, leaving behind a room full of men who've learned that the human mind can be as precisely manipulated as any physical weapon. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to refine these techniques, new subjects for psychological experimentation, new innovations in the ancient art of breaking human spirits. In the flickering shadows, you realize you've witnessed the birth of something that transcends simple cruelty, a systematic approach to psychological warfare that would influence military thinking for generations to come. Lean closer now, and let me shatter an assumption that has colored our understanding of Viking Age cruelty for centuries. The most calculated, most psychologically sophisticated, most devastatingly effective acts of systematic violence weren't always orchestrated by the warriors whose names echo through the sagas. Sometimes, they were planned by women who understood that, in a world that saw them as property, power could only be seized through methods so shocking that even hardened men would step back in respectful terror. Meet Queen Gunhild of Norway, sitting at her loom in the soft light of a winter afternoon, her fingers working the threads with the same methodical precision she applies to orchestrating political assassinations. The domestic scene is deliberately deceptive. This woman has learned to weaponize every assumption about feminine harmlessness, turning cultural expectations into tools of unprecedented political power. Feel the silk threads beneath her fingers as she contemplates the problem of Earl Egil, who has been questioning her husband King Eric's legitimacy. Traditional masculine solutions, direct confrontation, battlefield challenge, open warfare, are crude instruments that create martyrs and rally opposition. Gunhild's approach will be far more devastating. She will destroy not just Egil, but the very idea of challenging her family's rule. Watch her face as she plans, noting the slight smile that plays around her lips. Egil has 3 sons, 2 daughters, an aging mother he adores, and a younger brother whose loyalty wavers. Most importantly, he has a reputation for honor that his enemies respect and his allies depend upon. Gunhild will turn these strengths into weapons against him. The threads of her weaving create a pattern as intricate as her psychological manipulation. Over the coming months, Egil's youngest son will be kidnapped during what appears to be a simple robbery. The boy won't be harmed. Instead, he'll be treated like an honored guest, given fine clothes, excellent food, education from learned men. But Egil will know, with absolute certainty, that his son's comfort depends entirely on his own behavior. But this is just the opening move in a game of psychological chess that makes traditional warfare seem like children's play. Gunhild understands that simple hostage-taking creates clear moral lines. Everyone knows who the victim is, who the villain is. Her genius lies in creating moral ambiguity that paralyzes her enemy's decision-making. Notice how she manipulates information flow. Egil receives reports that his son is not just safe, but thriving. Learning languages, developing skills, clearly healthy and well-treated. Other reports suggest the boy has grown fond of his captors, that he speaks fondly of Queen Gunhild, that he seems reluctant to discuss returning home. Each piece of information is carefully calculated to create psychological pressure that makes direct action impossible. Feel the cold intelligence as she addresses her network of female allies, the wives, daughters, and sisters of powerful men who gather for what appears to be simple domestic socializing. These women have learned from Gunhild's example, understanding that feminine spaces, dismissed by men as politically irrelevant, are actually perfect laboratories for psychological manipulation. Men think in terms of armies and battles, she tells them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has reshaped the political landscape through pure psychological pressure. They prepare for the attacks they can see, but we move through their blind spots. Their assumptions about our powerlessness become our greatest weapons. You witness how these women have developed techniques that male warriors couldn't imagine. They manipulate religious customs, turning sacred festivals into opportunities for political assassination. They exploit the trust that comes with shared domestic spaces, using healing knowledge to create subtle poisons that mimic natural illnesses. They understand how to turn children into unwitting spies, how to manipulate marriage arrangements into political traps, how to use pregnancy and childbirth as tools of temporal power. But Gunhild's masterpiece is still unfolding. Eagle's captured son isn't just being well treated, he's being psychologically conditioned to prefer his new life to his old one. The boy is surrounded by luxury, education, opportunity that his father's modest holding could never provide. More insidiously, he's gradually learning to see his father's political positions as backward, primitive, harmful to the very people Egil claims to protect. Watch Gunhild's face as reports arrive of Egil's growing psychological distress. The Earl can't attack without endangering his son. He can't negotiate from strength because everyone knows his weakness. He can't ignore the situation because his political enemies are using his apparent powerlessness to undermine his authority. Most devastatingly, he's beginning to question whether rescuing his son would actually harm the boy's prospects. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, creating scenarios where every possible action serves the manipulator's interests. If Egil attacks, he becomes a father who endangers his own child for political ambition. If he submits, he becomes a broken man whose authority evaporates. If he attempts rescue, he disrupts his son's superior education and opportunities. If he does nothing, his political irrelevance becomes absolute. But Gunhild isn't finished. Through carefully orchestrated social events, she arranges for Egil to actually meet his son in controlled circumstances. The boy is polite, respectful, clearly healthy and well-educated. But there's a distance in his eyes, a subtle shift in loyalty that breaks his father's heart more effectively than any physical torture could. Feel the psychological complexity as you realize that Gunhild's methods often produce genuine benefits for some of her victims. The captured son really is receiving superior education and opportunities. Some of her political enemies' families genuinely thrive under her protection. Her manipulation creates real value alongside real suffering, making moral judgments impossibly complex. Now travel north to meet Sigrid the Haughty of Sweden, whose methods make Gunhild's psychological sophistication seem almost gentle. Sigrid has discovered that in a world where women are expected to be passive recipients of male desire, the controlled use of sexuality becomes a weapon of mass destruction that can destabilize entire kingdoms. Watch her prepare for a feast where she'll meet potential suitors, kings and earls who see marriage to her as a path to political alliance with Sweden. She moves through her preparations with the precision of a general planning, a siege, understanding that every gesture, every word, every carefully calculated moment of vulnerability or strength will reshape the political landscape. But Sigrid's true genius lies in understanding how masculine pride becomes self-destructive when properly manipulated. She will encourage these powerful men to compete for her attention, to make increasingly extravagant promises, to commit themselves to positions that serve her interests. Then, at the moment of their greatest expectation, she will reveal the trap. The great hall burns, literally burns, with the screams of suitors who discovered too late that Sigrid's apparent vulnerability was perfect camouflage for calculated murder. 2 kings die in the flames, along with their retinues, their political plans, their threats to Swedish independence. The message resonates across Northern Europe. Underestimating this woman's capacity for violence is a fatal mistake. Feel the cold satisfaction in her voice as she addresses the survivors. I will rid Sweden of small kings who offer me insults. But you understand that this isn't passionate revenge. It's calculated political communication designed to reshape how powerful men approach both her and Sweden itself. These women have discovered that in a world built on masculine assumptions about feminine weakness, the controlled revelation of feminine capacity for violence creates disproportionate psychological impact. A man who kills rivals is expected and feared. A woman who kills rivals is unnatural and terrifying, her actions rippling through cultural consciousness in ways that reshape behavior far beyond her immediate political sphere. As you witness these queens of carnage at work, you realize that history's focus on male violence has obscured something equally important: the sophisticated ways that women navigated and manipulated systems designed to exclude them from power. Their methods were often more psychologically sophisticated than male alternatives, precisely because they had to be. Direct confrontation wasn't available, so indirect manipulation became an art form. The firelight dances across faces that have learned to transform cultural expectations into weapons, revealing that the most devastating cruelties of the Viking Age weren't always products of masculine rage, but sometimes of feminine intelligence applied to the systematic destruction of human will. Deep in the sacred grove of Othin, where ancient trees twist their branches into shapes that seem to writhe with supernatural intelligence, you stand witness to a transformation that will haunt your dreams for centuries. The morning mist clings to moss-covered stones as 12 warriors, the legendary sons of Arngrim, prepare for a ritual that blurs every line between religious ecstasy, calculated barbarism, and genuine madness. Feel the dampness of the forest floor beneath your feet as you watch these men consume a mixture that has been prepared with deadly precision. Fermented mare's milk laced with psychoactive mushrooms, herbs that dilate pupils and accelerate heartbeat, and substances that modern pharmacology would recognize as powerful dissociatives. But this isn't mere drug use. It's a religious sacrament designed to temporarily dissolve the boundaries between human consciousness and divine fury. The eldest son, Angantyr, speaks in a voice that already carries the rough edge of someone departing normal human experience. We go now to the place where Uthin waits. We leave behind the weakness of individual will. We become the instruments of the All-Father's wrath. His words carry the authority of religious conviction, but you notice how his hands shake with anticipation that seems to transcend spiritual devotion. Watch their faces as the substances take hold. Pupils dilate until their eyes become dark pools reflecting firelight. Breathing patterns change, becoming deep and rhythmic like predators preparing to hunt. Most disturbing of all, their expressions shift from human consciousness to something altogether different. Not madness exactly, but a kind of focused inhumanity that transforms familiar faces into masks of divine rage. The psychological transformation you're witnessing represents one of the most sophisticated manipulation techniques in Viking Age warfare. The systematic use of religious framework to eliminate moral constraints entirely. These berserkers haven't simply lost control. They found a way to surrender individual conscience to collective ritual, creating a state where acts of extreme cruelty become expressions of religious devotion. Feel the temperature drop as their voices begin the ancient chants, Old Norse words that seem to carry physical weight in the forest air. But listen carefully to what they're actually saying. These aren't random battle songs, but carefully constructed psychological programming designed to reshape their own consciousness. Each verse reinforces their transformation from individual humans into collective instruments of supernatural violence. We are the wolves of the battle god. We feast on the flesh of cowards. We drink the blood of those who flee. We are no longer men, but weapons in the hands of eternity. The repetition creates a hypnotic effect that combines with the chemical substances to produce a state of consciousness that traditional psychology would struggle to categorize. But here's what makes your blood run cold. This isn't mindless frenzy. In their altered state, these berserkers become capable of strategic thinking that transcends normal human limitations, while simultaneously abandoning normal human moral constraints. They'll fight with tactical intelligence, while committing acts of cruelty that would traumatize them in normal consciousness. The ritual reaches its crescendo as they begin to physically transform. Watch Angantyr as he drops to all fours, his movements becoming fluid and predatory. His brothers follow, their human posture dissolving into something that suggests wolves or bears more than men. The sounds they make, growling, howling, snarling, aren't human vocalizations, but they're not simple animal sounds either. There's something in between, something that suggests consciousness that has transcended normal categories entirely. You witness how this transformation creates a feedback loop of religious and psychological reinforcement. The berserkers believe they're becoming divine instruments, and their altered brain chemistry produces experiences that seem to confirm this belief. They feel stronger, more perceptive, freed from normal human limitations. And their religious framework interprets these sensations as proof of supernatural intervention. But the true horror emerges when you realize how they use this state for calculated cruelty that goes far beyond battlefield necessity. In their religious frenzy, acts of extreme violence become sacraments, torture becomes worship, the systematic destruction of human dignity becomes communion with the divine. They found a way to transform the worst aspects of human nature into religious experience. Listen to them discussing their upcoming raid with voices that still carry human intelligence despite their transformed consciousness. The Christian monks will beg their God for mercy that will not come. Their prayers will become screams that honor the All-Father. Their suffering will feed the wolves of Valhalla. The language is religious, but the planning is methodical and sophisticated. The psychological sophistication becomes clear as you observe how they target their victims' spiritual beliefs as much as their physical bodies. They've learned that destroying someone's faith creates deeper trauma than merely destroying their body. They'll force Christian priests to renounce their God, make them participate in Norse religious rituals, turn their own sacred symbols into instruments of torture. Feel the forest air grow thick with something that transcends normal atmosphere as their transformation completes. These are no longer 12 individual men, but a collective entity whose consciousness operates according to rules that normal psychology cannot explain. They move with perfect coordination, despite having no apparent leader. They communicate through growls and gestures that convey complex tactical information. Most disturbing of all, they show genuine joy in their transformed state. Not the grim satisfaction of duty, but the ecstatic happiness of creatures fulfilling their deepest nature. But you begin to understand the terrible cost of this transformation as you observe its aftermath. When the religious frenzy fades and normal consciousness returns, these men are left with memories of acts they committed in their divine state. Some embrace these memories as proof of their religious devotion. Others are traumatized by recollections of cruelties they cannot reconcile with their normal moral framework. The psychological fragmentation creates warriors who live in multiple realities simultaneously. In normal consciousness, they might be loving fathers, skilled craftsmen, respected community members. In berserker state, they become instruments of systematic cruelty that would shock professional torturers. The religious framework allows them to compartmentalize these identities, but the psychological stress of maintaining such divisions takes a terrible toll. Watch Angantyr's face as the ritual concludes, and he returns to something approaching normal consciousness. There's a moment of confusion, then recognition, then something like grief as he realizes what he's about to become again. We are blessed and cursed, he says quietly, to carry the god's fury. We see what others cannot see, do what others cannot do, suffer what others cannot understand. You realize that you've witnessed one of history's most sophisticated systems for producing systematic cruelty through religious manipulation. The berserker tradition creates a framework where extreme violence becomes not just acceptable, but sacred, where acts of torture become expressions of divine will, where the systematic destruction of human dignity becomes a path to spiritual transcendence. The forest grows quiet as the transformed warriors depart for their raid, leaving behind only the lingering scent of psychoactive smoke and the knowledge that some forms of human cruelty transcend individual pathology to become collective religious experience. The berserker's curse isn't madness. It's the deliberate cultivation of a consciousness that finds the sacred in the systematic destruction of human suffering. As dawn breaks through the ancient trees, you carry with you the uncomfortable knowledge that religious framework can be manipulated to justify and enable acts of cruelty that would be impossible under secular moral systems. The berserkers have found a way to make extreme violence not just acceptable, but holy. Step now from the shadows of historical imagination into the harsh fluorescent light of a modern archaeological laboratory. where the real evidence of Viking Age cruelty lies spread across stainless steel tables in forms that cannot lie, cannot exaggerate, cannot transform horror into heroic saga. Here, in the patient silence of forensic science, the bones speak truths that medieval chroniclers dared not write. Dr. Sarah Lund's latex gloves move carefully across the skeleton designated Burial 847A, discovered in the Danish town of Roskilde. But this isn't the dignified interment of a warrior who died gloriously in battle. The scratch marks on the ribs tell a different story. Thin, precise cuts that were made while the victim was still alive. Marks that speak of prolonged, methodical torture that lasted hours or possibly days. Feel the clinical coldness of the examination room as you lean closer to observe what 1400 years have preserved with uncomfortable clarity. The victim's hands show defensive wounds, cuts across the palms where desperate fingers tried to grab blades, broken bones where hands were deliberately crushed to prevent further resistance. But it's the skull that tells the most disturbing story. Run your finger along the smooth depression in the temporal bone, not the crushing blow of a battle axe, but the careful work of someone who understood anatomy, who knew exactly how much pressure to apply to create maximum pain without causing immediate death. The forensic pathologist's report speaks in the dry language of medical science, evidence of prolonged cranial pressure consistent with deliberate torture using specialized tools. But the bones from Roskilde are just the beginning. Travel now to the mass grave sites of Dorset, England, where recent excavations have revealed evidence of Viking raids that went far beyond anything described in contemporary chronicles. Here, 51 skeletons tell a story of such systematic cruelty that the archaeological team required counselling after completing their analysis. Notice how the bodies were arranged, not randomly buried, but carefully positioned in ways that suggest ritualistic elements to their deaths. Children's bones show evidence of prolonged malnutrition before death, suggesting they were kept alive and deliberately starved as psychological pressure against their parents. Adult skeletons display torture marks that follow consistent patterns, indicating not chaotic violence, but systematic techniques that were taught, practiced, and refined. Dr. James Morrison, the lead archaeologist, speaks quietly as he shows you a child's skull bearing unmistakable evidence of trepanation holes, drilled into living bone with primitive tools. This wasn't medical treatment, he explains, his voice carrying the weight of someone who has stared too long into the abyss of human cruelty. The placement, the technique, the lack of healing. This was torture designed to cause maximum psychological trauma to witnesses while keeping the victim conscious and aware. Feel the temperature drop as you examine the evidence from the Trelleborg excavations in Denmark, where archaeologists discovered what can only be described as a medieval torture laboratory. The wooden tools didn't survive, but their metal components tell a story of sophisticated instruments designed specifically for prolonged human suffering. Iron implements with carefully filed edges, adjustable mechanisms for applying graduated pressure, tools that demonstrate a level of premeditation that transforms individual sadism into systematic methodology. The isotope analysis of bones from various sites reveals something even more disturbing, evidence of what modern criminologists would recognize as torture tourism. Victims show chemical signatures indicating they traveled long distances before death, not as part of normal population movement, but as captives transported specifically for specialized forms of cruelty that required particular expertise or equipment. But perhaps most chilling is the evidence of what archaeologists term performance torture, cruelty designed not just to extract information or punish enemies, but to create psychological effects on witnessing populations. Mass grave sites consistently show evidence of victims who were kept alive and tortured in public view before final execution, their suffering choreographed for maximum psychological impact on surrounding communities. Notice the precision in the bone modifications from the site near Stockholm, where 17 individuals show identical patterns of systematic mutilation. The marks are too consistent to be the result of individual sadism or battlefield frenzy. They represent standardized techniques that were taught and practiced, suggesting institutions devoted to the refinement of human suffering as a military and political tool. The forensic anthropologist's reconstruction of trauma patterns reveals something that medieval chroniclers could never capture: the sheer duration of many torture sessions. Healing patterns on bones indicate that victims were kept alive and tortured repeatedly over periods of weeks or months. Their suffering extended not through incompetence, but through calculated medical knowledge that prevented death while maximizing pain. Carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis reveal that these systematic torture techniques evolved and became more sophisticated over time. Early Viking Age remains show evidence of crude but effective violence. Later period, bones demonstrate increasingly refined methods that suggest formal training, institutional knowledge, and continuous innovation in the technology of human suffering. The DNA analysis adds another layer of horror to the archaeological record. Genetic evidence shows that some torture victims were close relatives of their perpetrators, siblings, cousins, sometimes even children. The political and psychological pressures that could drive individuals to torture their own family members with such methodical precision speak to social systems that completely subordinated personal relationships to collective violence. Feel the weight of scientific objectivity as you review the comprehensive database that now exists, documenting Viking Age torture techniques through archaeological evidence. Over 300 burial sites across Northern Europe tell consistent stories of systematic cruelty that operated according to established protocols rather than chaotic violence. The laboratory falls quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights, as you absorb the full implications of what the bones reveal. These aren't the glorious deaths of saga heroes, or the clean violence of Hollywood Vikings. These are the preserved remains of real people who experienced sophisticated forms of torture that were carefully planned, methodically executed, and continuously refined by individuals who had turned human suffering into both science and art. The archaeological record forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the past that literary sources often obscured or romanticized. The bones cannot be argued with, cannot be reinterpreted through cultural bias, cannot be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. They preserve, in calcium and phosphate, the physical evidence of choices made by real people who decided that systematic cruelty was an acceptable tool for achieving political, military, or personal goals. As you leave the laboratory, the sterile fluorescent light giving way to natural daylight, you carry with you the knowledge that the most reliable witnesses to historical cruelty aren't the chroniclers who wrote to glorify or condemn, but the bones themselves, silent, patient, and absolutely honest about what human beings are capable of doing to one another. When moral constraints dissolve and systematic violence becomes normalized practice. Settle back now into your comfortable surroundings, and let's explore the most uncomfortable question of all. What transforms ordinary human beings into the architects of systematic cruelty we've encountered tonight? As you feel the safety of your modern world around you, the locked doors, the rule of law, the social contracts that make extreme violence unthinkable, try to understand that the people we've met weren't born monsters. They were shaped by forces that, under different circumstances, might have shaped you or me. Close your eyes and imagine the psychological landscape of 9th century Scandinavia, where survival itself depended on constant vigilance and the willingness to inflict violence before others inflicted it upon you. Feel the bone-deep cold of winters that killed the unprepared, the gnawing hunger of crop failures that eliminated the weak, the social pressures that demanded displays of strength from anyone who hoped to protect their families. But here's what makes this exploration so psychologically challenging. Most of the individuals we've encountered weren't psychopaths in the clinical sense. Modern psychological assessment of their documented behaviors suggests that many would have tested within normal ranges for empathy, intelligence, and emotional regulation. What transformed them wasn't genetic abnormality or inherent evil, but the systematic erosion of moral constraints through cultural pressure, environmental necessity, and social reward systems that incentivized cruelty. Consider Ivar the Boneless, whose calculated approach to torture suggests a mind capable of sophisticated planning and genuine strategic brilliance. In our world, such intelligence might have produced a successful CEO, an innovative scientist, or a transformative political leader. But placed in a context where physical limitations threatened survival and social status depended on reputation for ruthless effectiveness, the same intellectual gifts became tools for systematic human destruction. Feel the psychological weight of understanding that empathy, the trait we consider most fundamental to moral behavior, isn't a constant human characteristic, but a variable that responds to social context. The berserkers we witnessed didn't lose their capacity for emotional connection. They learned to channel it selectively. maintaining deep bonds with their warrior brothers while completely dehumanizing their victims. This selective empathy appears throughout our historical examples. Halfdan the Black was reportedly a devoted father who showed genuine tenderness toward his children while simultaneously developing torture techniques that traumatized entire populations. Queen Gunhild maintained loving relationships with family members while orchestrating psychological campaigns that destroyed other families completely. The psychological mechanisms that enabled such compartmentalization are disturbingly familiar to modern research on moral disengagement. People who commit systematic cruelty typically employ cognitive strategies that preserve their self-image. As good people, they redefine victims as subhuman, frame violence as necessary for greater good, distribute responsibility across groups to minimize individual guilt, or construct elaborate justifications that transform cruelty into virtue. Watch how this process operates in the Viking context. Slavery wasn't seen as cruelty, but as natural order thralls were considered fundamentally different from free people. Their suffering no more morally significant than animal suffering. Torture of enemies became religious devotion. Pain inflicted in Othin's name was sacred rather than sadistic. The systematic psychological destruction of opposing communities was strategic necessity. Breaking enemy morale prevented greater bloodshed in prolonged conflicts. But perhaps most unsettling is recognizing how social reward systems shaped individual psychology. The Vikings, who developed the most creative torture techniques, who showed the greatest sophistication in psychological warfare, who demonstrated the most ruthless effectiveness in breaking enemy will. Their communities celebrated their innovations in cruelty as marks of superior intelligence and strategic thinking. Feel the psychological pressure of living in a world where moral sensitivity was often interpreted as dangerous weakness. Individuals who showed reluctance to participate in systematic cruelty faced social ostracism, political marginalization, and ultimately physical vulnerability. The choice wasn't between good and evil in abstract terms, but between personal survival and moral purity in immediate, life-threatening terms. This creates one of the most disturbing insights into human psychology. Moral behavior often depends less on inherent character than on social structures that either reward or punish ethical choices. The same individuals who became legendary for cruelty might have become models of compassion in societies that rewarded kindness and punished violence. Consider how modern psychology understands the development of antisocial behavior. Childhood trauma, social isolation, exposure to violence, lack of positive role models, absence of consequences for harmful behavior. All of these factors appear consistently in the backgrounds of people who commit systematic cruelty. Now consider that Viking Age society normalized most of these experiences as necessary preparation for adult survival. Children were exposed to extreme violence from early ages, not through neglect, but through deliberate socialization designed to prepare them for a world where squeamishness could be fatal. Young people were rewarded for displays of callousness and punished for showing mercy toward enemies. Adult role models demonstrated that social success depended on the willingness to inflict suffering when strategically necessary. The psychological effects of chronic violence exposure create lasting changes in brain chemistry and cognitive processing. Individuals repeatedly exposed to extreme trauma often develop hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and increased tolerance for violence that makes extreme behavior seem normal. In Viking society, these trauma responses weren't pathology, but adaptive survival mechanisms that were culturally reinforced and socially rewarded. But understanding these psychological mechanisms raises deeply uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility. If systematic cruelty emerges from predictable responses to environmental pressure and social conditioning, how do we balance compassionate understanding with moral judgment? How do we acknowledge the humanity of people who chose inhumane actions while still condemning the choices they made? The answer might lie in recognizing that understanding evil doesn't require excusing it. The psychological forces that shaped Ivar's cruelty, Halfdan's innovations in torture, or Gunhild's manipulative strategies were real and powerful. But they weren't irresistible. Even within Viking society, some individuals chose mercy over cruelty, protection over exploitation, healing over harm. These alternative choices prove that moral agency survived, even in contexts that strongly incentivized immoral behavior. The capacity for compassion, justice, and human dignity existed alongside the capacity for systematic cruelty, suggesting that individual character did matter even when social pressures toward violence were overwhelming. As you absorb these psychological insights from the safety of your modern context, you might feel grateful for living in a world where legal systems punish rather than reward systematic cruelty, where social structures generally support rather than undermine moral behavior, where the psychology of violence is studied and treated rather than celebrated and refined. But this gratitude should come with humility and vigilance. The psychological mechanisms that enabled Viking Age cruelty haven't disappeared from human nature. They've simply been constrained by different social contexts. Understanding how ordinary people became capable of extraordinary evil reminds us that moral progress isn't automatic or permanent, that requires constant effort to maintain social structures that reward our better angels while constraining our darker impulses. As you rest in the security of your contemporary world, surrounded by the invisible but powerful protections of international law, human rights frameworks, and social institutions designed to prevent systematic cruelty, it's tempting to view the Viking Age as a safely distant chapter in humanity's darker past. But the psychological patterns we've explored tonight haven't vanished. They've simply taken different forms, constrained by different social structures, manifesting in contexts that might be more familiar than we'd like to admit. Feel the uncomfortable recognition as you consider how the same mechanisms that enabled Viking Age cruelty continue to operate in modern contexts. The selective empathy that allowed berserkers to maintain loving relationships with their families while dehumanizing their victims appears in contemporary situations where people show genuine care for their immediate communities while supporting policies that cause systematic suffering for distant others. The psychological compartmentalization that enabled Halfdan the Black to be a devoted father and innovative torturer simultaneously echoes in modern individuals who maintain caring personal relationships while participating in institutional systems that cause significant harm to vulnerable populations. The cognitive mechanisms haven't changed, only the contexts in which they operate. Notice how the social reward systems that celebrated Viking Age innovations in cruelty find parallels in contemporary situations where individuals gain status, wealth, or power through activities that cause systematic harm to others. The specific behaviors are different, but the underlying psychology, where harmful actions are reframed as necessary strategy, creative problem solving, or competitive advantage, remains remarkably consistent. The dehumanization techniques that enabled Viking slave traders to treat human beings as commodities appear in modern contexts where economic systems, bureaucratic structures, or ideological frameworks create psychological distance between decision makers and those affected by their choices. The mechanisms for reducing people to statistics, categories, or abstract problems remain disturbingly familiar. But perhaps most importantly, consider how the gradual normalization of extreme behavior that characterized Viking society continues to operate in contemporary contexts. Just as Viking communities slowly adapted to accept increasingly sophisticated forms of cruelty as normal strategic thinking, modern societies sometimes experience gradual shifts in moral boundaries that make previously unthinkable behaviors seem acceptable or even necessary. The psychological research on moral disengagement reveals how ordinary people become capable of participating in systematic harm through incremental steps that gradually erode ethical constraints. Each small compromise makes the next slightly larger compromise easier to justify, creating pathways toward behavior that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the process. Feel the weight of recognizing that the social conditions that enabled Viking Age cruelty, resource scarcity, intergroup competition, weak institutional constraints on violence, social reward systems that favored aggression over cooperation, haven't been permanently eliminated from human experience. They continue to emerge in different forms, creating contexts where the same psychological mechanisms that shaped Viking behavior can reshape contemporary behavior. The group loyalty that enabled berserkers to commit atrocities in service of their warrior brotherhood appears in modern contexts where institutional loyalty, ideological commitment, or group identity override individual moral judgment. The techniques for diffusing personal responsibility across group structures remain remarkably consistent across centuries and cultures. But here's what should give us hope rather than despair. Understanding these psychological patterns also reveals how they can be interrupted and redirected. The same social mechanisms that can enable systematic cruelty can also be harnessed to promote systematic kindness, justice, and human dignity. Modern societies have developed institutional frameworks specifically designed to constrain the psychological tendencies that enabled Viking Age cruelty. Legal systems that punish rather than reward violence, international bodies that monitor and respond to systematic human rights violations, educational approaches that promote empathy and critical thinking, economic structures that provide alternatives to zero-sum competition. All of these represent conscious efforts to channel human psychology toward constructive rather than destructive outcomes. The psychological research that helps us understand how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary evil also reveals how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary good. The same social influence mechanisms that can promote harmful behavior can promote helpful behavior. The same cognitive patterns that can enable systematic cruelty can enable systematic compassion. Consider how modern understanding of trauma psychology helps us recognize and treat the kinds of psychological damage that Viking society normalized and even celebrated. Where Viking culture reinforced the trauma responses that made extreme violence seem necessary and normal, contemporary therapeutic approaches work to heal those responses and restore capacity for empathy, emotional regulation, and moral reasoning. The institutional supports for moral behavior that were largely absent in Viking society, social safety nets that reduce desperate competition for resources, legal protections for vulnerable populations, educational systems that promote ethical reasoning, economic opportunities that provide alternatives to exploitation, represent conscious collective choices to create social contexts that support rather than undermine human moral development. But maintaining these protections requires constant vigilance and effort. The psychological tendencies that enabled Viking Age cruelty remain dormant within human nature, ready to emerge when social conditions create the right combination of pressure, opportunity, and moral permission. Understanding this isn't cause for despair, but for determination. Determination to maintain and strengthen the social structures that constrain our worst impulses while promoting our better ones. As you reflect on these connections between historical and contemporary psychology, you might feel both sobered by the persistence of harmful human tendencies and encouraged by the possibility of constructive social change. The same species that produced the systematic cruelty of the Viking Age has also produced modern human rights frameworks, international humanitarian law, and sophisticated understanding of how to promote psychological healing and moral development. The choice between these different expressions of human potential isn't predetermined by genetics or destiny, but depends on the collective social choices we make about which behaviors to reward, which institutions to support, which values to teach, and which protections to maintain. Understanding the psychology of historical evil isn't just an exercise in historical curiosity. It's preparation for the ongoing work of creating social contexts that bring out the best rather than the worst in human nature. Your comfortable, secure surroundings tonight represent the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who chose to build systems that protect rather than exploit, heal rather than harm, include rather than exclude. These systems aren't perfect or permanent, but they demonstrate humanity's capacity to learn from its darkest chapters and choose different paths forward. As our journey through the shadows of the Viking Age draws toward its close, take a moment to feel your way back to the present moment. Notice the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blankets, the steady rhythm of your breathing in air that carries no scent of smoke from burning villages, no sound of distant screams, no threat of violence breaking suddenly into peaceful dreams. What we've experienced together tonight, this intimate encounter with some of the darkest aspects of human behavior, might seem like a strange gift to offer someone seeking comfort at the end of a long day. But there's profound wisdom in the ancient practice of contemplating mortality, suffering, and human frailty, not to invite despair, but to cultivate gratitude for the precious, fragile miracle of peaceful existence. Feel the weight of understanding how much of what you take for granted, the ability to sleep safely, To trust that morning will bring predictable routines rather than life-threatening chaos. To assume that the people around you share basic agreements about human dignity and the unacceptability of systematic cruelty represents achievements that countless generations fought, suffered, and died to create. The comfortable certainty that you will not wake to the sound of splintering wood and human screams, that your children will not be dragged away as slaves, that your community's elders will not be tortured for public entertainment. These simple securities represent victory in humanity's longest war, the struggle between our capacity for systematic cruelty and our capacity for systematic compassion. But understanding historical darkness offers gifts beyond gratitude for modern safety. In confronting the worst choices that human beings have made, we gain deeper appreciation for the moral courage required to make better choices, especially when social pressures reward cruelty and punish mercy. The Vikings who chose kindness over cruelty, protection over exploitation, healing over harm their choices, become more heroic when we understand the forces they resisted. Consider how your own daily moral choices, small acts of kindness toward strangers, decisions to speak truthfully when lies would be more convenient, moments when you choose to help rather than ignore others' suffering. Each choice for compassion over indifference, justice over convenience, truth over comfortable deception, adds strength to the social fabric that constrains our darker impulses. The people we've encountered tonight weren't fundamentally different from us in their basic psychology, their capacity for both good and evil, their vulnerability to social pressure and environmental stress. What made them capable of systematic cruelty wasn't genetic abnormality, but social conditions that rewarded the worst aspects of human nature while punishing the best. Recognizing this similarity isn't cause for fear, but for humility and responsibility. Understanding that you possess the same psychological raw material that, under different circumstances, might have produced very different moral outcomes, should inspire not self-condemnation, but conscious gratitude for the social structures, educational opportunities, moral examples, and cultural frameworks that have shaped your capacity for ethical reasoning and empathetic response. The safety and comfort you experienced tonight didn't emerge automatically from human progress, but from countless individual decisions by people who chose to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to include rather than exclude. Your peaceful rest is built on foundations laid by individuals who often paid high personal costs for choosing moral behavior over social advantage. But perhaps the greatest gift of confronting historical darkness is gaining perspective on your own struggles and suffering. The challenges you face, whether they involve relationships, career disappointments, health concerns, financial stress, or personal grief, occur within a context of unprecedented safety, opportunity, and social support that makes them manageable in ways that were unimaginable for most of human history. This doesn't minimize the reality of your difficulties or suggest that modern suffering is somehow less valid than historical suffering. Pain is pain, loss is loss, fear is fear, regardless of historical context. But understanding the magnitude of what previous generations endured to create the world you inhabit can provide comfort during difficult times and strength for facing challenges that might otherwise seem overwhelming. The systematic cruelty we've explored tonight was ultimately self-defeating. Societies built on violence, exploitation, and fear eventually collapse under the weight of their own brutality. The Viking Age ended not because external forces conquered it, but because its own contradictions made sustainable civilization impossible. Communities that invest their energy in destruction rather than creation, in taking rather than building, in breaking rather than healing, inevitably exhaust themselves. In contrast, the social structures that protect you tonight, laws that constrain violence, institutions that promote education and healing, economic systems that reward cooperation over exploitation, cultural values that celebrate compassion over cruelty, represent sustainable approaches to human organization that grow stronger rather than weaker over time. Your comfortable bed tonight sits within a civilization that has consciously chosen to reward rather than punish moral behavior, to protect rather than exploit vulnerable people, to heal rather than harm those who suffer. These choices aren't perfect or complete. Much work remains to be done, but they represent genuine progress in humanity's struggle to create social conditions that bring out our better rather than worse natures. As you prepare for sleep, carry with you not the weight of historical horror, but the lightness of historical perspective. The darkness we've explored together serves to illuminate the brightness of the world you actually inhabit, making visible the countless gifts of safety, dignity, and possibility that surround you like invisible blessings. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but they will unfold in a context shaped by centuries of people who chose light over darkness, building over destroying, love over fear. That's the true legacy of human history, not the cruelty that grabs attention, but the quiet heroism that creates the foundations for peaceful dreams. And now, my friend, as our journey through the long shadows of the Viking Age comes to its gentle close, let yourself slowly surface from the deep waters of historical contemplation back into the warm, immediate reality of your present moment. Feel your shoulders release tension you didn't realize you were carrying. Notice how your breathing naturally deepens and slows as you return to the simple, profound gift of safety. You are here, now, in a world where the systematic cruelties we've explored exist only as memories preserved in chronicles and bones, as lessons learned rather than dangers faced. The locked door of your home isn't just a barrier against intruders. It's a symbol of a civilization that has chosen to protect rather than prey upon its people. The gentle hum of electricity in your walls carries not just power for lights and warmth, but the accumulated knowledge of countless generations who chose to build rather than destroy. Listen to the ordinary sounds around you, perhaps the whisper of wind through trees that grow peacefully rather than hide warriors, the distant hum of traffic carrying people to destinations they freely chose, the soft sounds of neighbors living their own quiet lives behind walls that have never echoed with screams of torture or conquest. These gentle sounds are the music of a world that has learned, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely, to constrain its capacity for systematic cruelty. Feel the softness of your pillows, woven by hands that were never chained, sewn by people who returned home each evening to families they freely chose, transported by systems of trade built on mutual benefit rather than systematic exploitation. The comfort surrounding you represents not just personal good fortune, but humanity's hard-won victory over the assumption that security must be built on others' suffering. Your bed tonight cradles not just your body, but your dreams. And those dreams can unfold in peace because you live in a time and place where nightmares of systematic cruelty remain largely confined to history books and archaeological sites. The darkness we've explored together serves its purpose now, not to haunt your sleep, but to deepen your appreciation for the profound gift of peaceful rest. As your eyes grow heavy, let the weight of historical perspective settle into gratitude rather than anxiety. The struggles you face in your own life, whatever they may be, unfold within a context of protection, possibility, and hope that kings and queens of the Viking Age could never have imagined. Your challenges are real and worthy of your full attention and effort, but they exist within a safety net woven from centuries of moral progress. The people we met tonight, both perpetrators and victims, lived and died so that we might learn from their experiences. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if it teaches us the importance of choosing compassion over cruelty, building over destroying, healing over harming. Their stories become gifts rather than tragedies, when they inspire us to strengthen the social structures that make systematic cruelty unthinkable rather than inevitable. Let yourself drift now towards sleep, with the knowledge that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to choose kindness, to build rather than tear down, to heal rather than harm. Your daily moral choices, however small they might seem, connect you to the great historical project of creating a world where human dignity is protected rather than exploited, where vulnerability is met with care rather than cruelty. The Viking Age ended not through conquest, but through transformation. People gradually choosing different ways of organizing society, different values to celebrate, different behaviors to reward. You are part of that ongoing transformation, your choices contributing to the great human work of creating social conditions that bring out our better angels while constraining our darker impulses. Rest now in the knowledge that you are safe, protected by walls both physical and moral, that represent humanity's accumulated wisdom about how to live together without systematic cruelty. Your dreams tonight can unfold in peace because countless people before you chose to build the world that now cradles your sleep. Thank you for joining me on this journey through historical darkness toward contemporary light. Thank you for having the courage to confront difficult truths in service of deeper wisdom. Thank you for carrying forward the flame of human compassion that outlasts all the shadows of human cruelty. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow offers new opportunities to choose light over darkness, building over destroying, love over fear. The Viking Age is history. Your compassionate choices are the future. Sweet dreams, and may they be filled with peace.